Welcome everyone to our second panel. I am Tom Wright. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. I'm delighted to be chairing a really terrific panel discussion here. It's interesting to me that I think the first and second panels are quite linked in some ways because technology and economics have become core to national security. This is the more traditional security cooperation panel, the future of Japan-U.S. security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Over the last 8 years, we've seen real progress here, of course, with the Japan's role in the Quad, particularly being elevated to the leaders level, various trilats with the U.S. on the Philippines and South Korea, particularly on South Korea, I think real progress and deepening of cooperation being made. There's also been global elements to the cooperation as well. Japan has been very supportive of U.S. support for Ukraine and has played a key role in European security in some ways, as have other allies in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, we've seen European countries active in that region as well. But over the last sort of 8 months, the first 8 months of the second Trump administration, I think we've seen a number of flashpoints emerge, some tension between Washington and Tokyo over defense spending, where Pentagon officials, I think, have been pushing Japan to increase its levels of defense spending to 3.5%. Questions on, which we heard in the first panel as well, on the U.S. position toward China. Is the administration committed to strategic competition with China and looking to enlist allies in that effort? Or are we looking at something a little bit different, more focused on, summit diplomacy with China, an economic deal, something that sort of falls in the middle between engagement and strategic competition? We've seen the cancellation of the 2+2s between the U.S. and Japan, and also some larger questions about the role of the U.S. in the alliance and partnership system of the Indo-Pacific in general. And we're, of course, awaiting the National Defense Strategy, which should be out any day now. So there's lots and lots of issues to get into. The one thing that Professor Eikenberry said to me was make sure everyone only speaks for 5 minutes. So I think we have someone's going to hold up a flashcard when we get to the 5-minute mark. But I think we'll try to keep this as free-flowing as possible, and everyone sort of lead off with their 5 minutes of remarks, but then we'll sort of open it up to a conversation. I'll structure it if we need to, but I'm happy to just let it go if it just flows naturally. And I think we'll just follow the order of the speakers as is on the agenda. Firstly, Mishuri Nishida, who's the Director of Industrial Research at JETRO in New York, and I think you also have a number of other affiliations as well, right? So if I remember the bio sheet, so Special Advisor for the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in Japan, and also a senior meeting representative in the U.S. Covering those issues. So we start out with Mr. Nishida.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me such an important event. So I'm Mitsu Nishida. I'm originally from METI, and now I'm in the position in the JETRO as a special advisor for METI. It's a kind of curious position, special advisor. I'm really happy to hear Mr. Christensen's mentions to the Linus project, but because I was in charge of Linus project for more than 10 years ago. I'm one of the founder of Linus project, so I'm really happy to hear the Christians admirers. Anyway, so the U.S. and Japan should expand cooperation in the field of industrial policy in order to strengthen the alliance. My statement is strongly related to the first part of this conference. and specifically nuclear energy policy and the supply chain cooperation are critical. These are essential issues not only for the economy, but also for national security itself. The first of all, nuclear energies. More than 60% of the nuclear power plants currently under construction worldwide are being built by Russia and China. This poses a huge risk for future energy supply. In 2022, Japan announced a historic policy change and began constructing a new nuclear power plant in the western part of Japan. This policy shift came at the last minute because many Japanese companies with nuclear-related supply chains had nearly given up on maintaining them. Japan is now focusing on conventional large-scale reactors with advanced safety mechanisms, while at the same time exploring new types of reactors such as SMRs or gas-cooled reactors. However, it will take a long time to achieve this, which is why the Japanese nuclear industry should contribute its technology to the construction of next-generation reactors in the United States. Such collaboration could enhance the energy supply of both countries and help secure national securities. And the second point is the supply chains. It's strongly related to the first part. Risks to supply chains spread across many sectors. Specifically, as the first section mentioned, rare earths and critical minerals are recognized as direct national security issues. The United States and Japan are gradually advancing cooperation to build alternative supply chains. In addition to these materials, other raw materials, industrial components, and industrial products face similar risks. In chemicals, for example, Japanese companies have lost competitiveness due to Chinese overcapacity. One major firm, which supplies nearly 1/3 of Japan's ammonia, plans to cease production by 2028, raising the danger of excessive reliance on China. Japan and the United States, together with European countries, should start a high-level dialogue on how to sustain supply chain beyond China. It is easy to say, but difficult to take concrete action. We must pay attention not only to supply-side policy, but also to demand-side policy. Because in commercial transactions, the private sector tends to buy cheaper products rather than more expensive ones from alternative supply chain. Without such collaboration, it will be difficult to overcome China's dominance in the industrial sectors. So I think it is very important to collaborate such kind of demand-side policies, corporations in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second speaker on this panel, see if they have the order in here, is Professor Satori Mori, is at Keio University and Deputy Director for the Keio Center for Strategy. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank JEF and Princeton University SPIA for having me here today. It's a real privilege to be able to speak here today. I want to start out by making 3 points today. My first point is that I think it's undeniable that the new direction of Trump administration's foreign policy has created a sense of concern in Tokyo, but nevertheless, the fact that the United States remains to be the most important ally of Japan has not changed. So former Prime Minister Kishida remarked, Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. But when everybody saw the meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump in February, that sentence gained new meaning. Is this going to happen to East Asia today? But nevertheless, I want to sort of underscore the fact that the United States is still an important ally, despite this new sort of foreign policy direction under the banner of America First or Peace Through Strength. If you look at the economy, for Japan's export, the United States remains number one, 20.1% for 2023. And for imports, US is number two, 10.5% in terms. And in terms of share of global profits from foreign investment, between 2020 and 2024, profits from the United States increased from 20% to 26%, while profits from China decreased from 16% to 9%. So economically speaking, the United States is still very, very important for Japan. On the security side, as you are all aware, China's growing nuclear arsenal, increasing conventional capability, multifaceted coercion campaign against Taiwan, unilateral revisionist actions and coercive behavior in the South China Sea, and intrusion into Senkaku Island territorial space, as well as joint military activities with Russia, continues to present a formidable security challenge. And North Korea's nuclear development continues, and its military modernization is said to be benefiting from cooperation with Russia. So under these circumstances, the alliance with the United States is ever more important for Japan. And it does not have the luxury of creating a rift in its relations with the United States. So that is my first point. Second point, Japan, in the short term, needs to maintain a good relationship with the Trump administration that has a new definition of what constitutes a worthy ally. And I think there seems to be two yardsticks to judge the strategic value of an ally. The first one is economic yardstick, and it's composed of probably three elements. Number one, whether the ally is contributing to reducing trade imbalance. Number two, whether the ally is investing in the United States to boost manufacturing and increase jobs for American workers. And number three, whether the ally is cooperating with the United States on curbing advanced technology transfer to China. The recent economic agreement between Japan and the United States was a way to sort of recalibrate economic relations so that it could sort of satisfy President Trump and MAGA in order to keep the relationship on a good footing. The second yardstick is the security yardstick. And I think there are maybe two aspects to this. Number one is that whether the ally is spending enough on defense to minimize the risk of entrapping the United States into a regional conflict. And number two, whether the ally has enough capabilities to allow the United States to defend the ally at an acceptable cost and risk. If an ally brings high risk to the United States, that ally must pay accordingly. I think that's the thinking of the Trump administration. The Trump administration does not put a premium on shared values. So Japan's central objective is to obtain reconfirmation from the Trump administration that Japan remains as an indispensable economic and strategic asset of the United States. I think other Indo-Pacific US allies and partners will probably have to do the same, because without the notion that allies and partners remain as vital US assets, all defense cooperation efforts to deter China will not be credible. So US allies and partners need to work out deals and convince President Trump that they are too valuable and critical to abandon. If this kind of effort is lacking or falls short, President Trump could cut deals with countries like China that may work to the detriment of US allies and partners. So in the age of US transactional diplomacy, US allies and US rivals, i.e. China and Russia, will be bidding or competing for the distribution of security interests by the United States by offering economic incentives. My last point, third point, in the mid to long term, Japan needs to maintain the alliance with the United States while also significantly boosting its own defense capabilities and strengthening security cooperation with like-minded states. In light of the circumstances that I pointed out earlier, the next Japanese Prime Minister will have to make a political and strategic decision to determine the level of Japan's defense spending. His or her decision will have to be based on the government's assessment of its mid to long-term strategic environment and the level of domestic support he or she will be able to garner. Japan currently is implementing a plan to achieve 2% of GDP by 2027. And I think it will probably have to revise this upward because of the changing strategic circumstances based on its own assessment. Since Japan will have to make very large social security expenditures in the years to come, it will have to find ways to allow defense expenditure to also benefit the economy. So instead of framing it into a sort of guns or butters framework, I think we have to design it so that there's guns and butter meaning that we should invest in infrastructure and R&D that would not only benefit defense, but also benefit the economy in general. Japan will also have to become the hub of regional defense cooperation among US allies and partners in the region. And in the context of deterring China, particularly important will be Japan-U.S. Australia and Japan-U.S. Australia Philippines cooperation. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Our next speaker is Danny Russell. Danny is a distinguished fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, but of course also previously served in numerous high-level positions in the State Department and National Security Council. So Danny, over to you.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks to Princeton and to JEF for having me here. The case I'd like to make is that the U.S.-Japan partnership, and it's a partnership that goes well beyond the security alliance, is at the same time more important, more capable, but in many respects more vulnerable than it has ever been at any time. And important, as Professor Mori laid out, I think very, very articulately, in light of the pressure from China, in light of the very, very significant and undervalued threat from North Korea, which, while quiet relatively over the past few years, has really intensified, and also from the behavior of Russia, the challenges in critical technologies and so on. So important for regional reasons, for global reasons, for security reasons. I think the alliance clearly is more capable now than I think at any other point. There's very deep integration. The defense reforms, defense expansion on the Japanese side has made a huge difference. Joint planning, increased interoperability, joint exercises, including in new domains. So the alliance really has strengthened considerably. But that the partnership is under far greater stress than ever before. And again, Professor Mori alluded to it, but the combination of political shocks, of strategic diversion, of erosion of trust, of the weakening of political predictability in the relationship, and so on. So I came up with, and it's random, 5 sort of buckets of strategic challenges that face the partnership. First, to me, is the glaring political misalignment, the disruption, the distrust that's entered the relationship, the style, the president's style of applying pressure, the volatility in decision-making, and on the Japanese side, political leadership challenges. We're waiting the outcome of the LDP presidential election this weekend. And also a culture of caution and so on. So there's a real mismatch on the political side right now. I think there's a strategic misalignment in a sense, misalignment between strategic objectives, a kind of slippage between Japan's, broadly speaking, sort of pacifistic culture and application of power. The U.S., on the other hand, toggling back and forth between being invested in the region or being focused exclusively on China. Third, I would say, is a kind of is the uncoordinated decision-making mechanisms that we have between us that are not well configured yet for dealing with crisis situations. There is an impulsivity right now in decision-making in Washington, which conflicts with the risk-averse character of Japanese decision-making. And of course, there's wild inconsistency and uncertainty about the U.S.-China policy, and we're all waiting for the surprises that may come out of the impending meeting in Korea between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. Fourth, I would say, is the economic and the trade friction, which is intensified. There's a coercive, transactional approach from Washington. There's no common playbook, really, for de-risking China exposure. And lastly, what I would call fragmentation, whether that is the rise of competing blocs, the multipolar hedging, the proliferation of Japan's own lateral partnerships with Australia or South Korea, which fills some gaps but also challenges alliance cohesion. Anyway, my bottom line would be the partnership is threatened by these various forms of misalignment and mistrust. There are poor prospects for resolution anytime in the near term. We really have to think about the longer term and how we can make smart bets for the future. Common sense, I think, suggests that it's prudent for us to build on those areas of strength that we already have, as we heard earlier, as Aaron said, sort of the inkblot strategy of building out from what you've got, mill, leading edge technology, digital rulemaking, those sorts of things, build on that. And identify and build on areas that can be worked in the current circumstances. And that means investing in strengthening some of the institutional connections, the bureaucratic connections, private sector, and so on. Aiming for the out years, looking ahead to a time when we can institutionalize some of the mechanisms, national security, economic security, technological security mechanisms that we're going to need for the longer term. And above all, I think treating the U.S.-Japan alliance not as a legacy platform that we just tend to, but as a common strategic platform that we can reshape to contend with the threats that challenge us now.
Thank you. Our fourth speaker is Chris Johnstone, who's a managing principal at the Asia Group, was previously at CISS and served in many positions at the White House, the Pentagon, and CIA. So, Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to Princeton and to JEF for inviting me to this event. It's a particular honor to be at something with John Eikenberry and Aaron Freeberg, both of whom were professors of mine just a few very short years ago. So really great to be here. Look, in 10 days or so, Japan will elect a new prime minister, and he or she will inherit a U.S.-Japan relationship that's in a deeply unsettled state and in a fundamentally different place from where it was just a year ago when the last new Japanese prime minister was elected. We're in an environment where, as Danny said, where the Trump administration is adopting a deeply transactional approach to U.S. alliances across the board, including with Japan. A time of deep frictions over trade and an America First industrial policy. Intense pressure from the administration on Japanese defense spending, which has resulted in essentially a freezing of senior dialogue. The 2+2 process, which is Secretaries of State and Defense with their counterparts, is the means that we use in government to push the alliance forward. That process is largely frozen, and the message from the administration is that the 2% goal that Japan set out really historically in 2022, that it's not enough, that Japan has to do more. U.S. disengagement, I think it's fair to say, from minilateralism in the region. Tom, you mentioned the Quad. There's no prospect at this point for a Quad leaders meeting this year. And finally, underpinning all of this is uncertainty about U.S. strategic direction, where the United States is on Europe and the war in Ukraine, and of course about on the relationship with China. I travel to Japan with some frequency. My sense is this is not a time of crisis in the relationship, but it is a time of fundamental questioning on both sides about the long-term credibility, reliability of this relationship. Certainly the most challenging time that I can remember in the 25 or so years that I've been around the relationship. I think the trade agreement that was recently announced helps in the short term, but there are lots of seeds of friction within that trade agreement that I think are likely to come to the fore again. And I think, and this is something that I think Japanese friends are getting their head around, these are dynamics that are going to persist beyond the next 3 years, right? There are some ways in which I think style will change after the current administration, but some of the fundamental principles of US engagement in the world are probably not going back to where they were before. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize that. So what to do? I'm going to try to be somewhat optimistic here and put out several reasons why I think the US-Japan relationship will continue to be vital, important to both countries, and a platform that serves to drive broader issues globally. I think and I'll give several reasons. First, I do think the strategic foundation remains strong. My view, and we can discuss this, is that US-China competition is a structural feature of the international order. No ally brings more to the table to help the US manage this challenge. And even if in the short term, the Trump administration is focused on pursuing a trade deal, I fully expect that the pendulum will shift back. Tom, you drafted the Biden administration's national security strategy, and in it you described China as the only actor with the intent and the capability to alter the international system. I think that's roughly what you wrote. And I think that's still the case. And I think that underlying structural reality will take hold again in US policy. So that's number one. Second, I think the military-to-military relationship is closer than ever. And this is what I would call the gorilla glue of the bilateral relationship. These are ties below the political radar, reflected in exercises and training of increasing complexity and sophistication. We're undergoing a transformation of the US military command structure in Japan that is real and meaningful and will change how the two countries cooperate militarily. And so at the military-to-military level, the relationship remains very strong and will continue to be so. Third, I think a minilateral architecture in the region remains possible, but Japan is going to have to lead it. And I think the advantage that we see today is that Japan has stronger relations than ever before with countries like Australia, the Philippines, the Republic of Korea. Under new leadership in South Korea, the relationship continues to be very strong and moving forward. So to sort of paraphrase a country song, it's time for Tokyo to take the wheel and drive the construction of a regional architecture, to carry that mission forward. Fourth, Japan is continuing to invest in defense and will need to do so. What I'm hearing is that there's a likelihood of a new national security strategy, national defense strategy, and defense build-up plan by the end of next year that will continue to reflect probably, Mori-sensei, additional growth in Japan's defense investments. So the sense of Japan stepping up and doing more, I think, is going to continue to be there, and that will be a powerful message back to Washington about the importance of Japan as an ally. And then fifth, and this is an area that I see directly in the work that I do at the Asia Group, is the deepening ties between our defense and national security technology industries. This is a new dimension in the relationship that has emerged from changes in Japanese policy, changes in how US industry is thinking about partnerships. US defense technology firms are interested in partnering with Japan in new ways. Japanese industry is emerging as a global player in the defense space. The recent announcement that Japan will build Australia's next generation of frigates is a significant step forward for Japanese industry. So this is a new and important constituency for the relationship. So I think there are reasons for optimism. But I do think it's important for Japanese friends to recognize that the United States is not going back. This is painful to me as someone who grew up and believes in the traditional American role in the world, but I think some fundamental things have changed, and even beyond 3 years from now, some of those features are likely to endure. So we need to think about this relationship and our roles in it in a different way, but it will continue to be strong. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Chris. So those are really great opening statements by everyone. Thank you all for adhering to the 5-minute rule. No need to be particularly coercive on my part. I would just say in just response, I guess, to Chris's final sort of point, or one of the key points he made about the U.S. not going back. I mean, that's possible. It's also possible, that there will be more of a pro-alliance administration more traditionally in the future. But where I agree, I think, is that, if you look at all U.S. elections since 1944, Republicans are in their 41st year and Democrats have had 40, right? So it basically splits 50-50. And during the Cold War, there were differences between the parties, but the similarities are by far more important. Now we may have a situation where one party is fairly traditionally pro-alliance in the sense that we've known that term, and another has quite a different view, and then the shifts between them from election to election, or whether it's 4 or 8 years, they'll be a lot more dramatic. And I think one question is, for our Japanese friends, is how would they need to prepare for that? If you need to be more resilient to more dramatic shifts than before. But where I wanted to start with, and maybe Mr. Nishida, we could start with you on this, because you talked a bit about industrial policy and the economic side. One defining characteristic of President Trump's approach to alliances in general, but also particularly to the U.S.-Japan alliance, is to link, economics and national security, and to say, because the United States is providing a security guarantee and security support, therefore the U.S. needs to be compensated, basically economically, not just that we have a win-win economic relationship, but it essentially needs to be tilted dramatically in America's favor, as sort of the quid pro quo for something that President Trump would regard as pretty unnatural, like a security alliance, along the lines that Professor Eikenberry and others have written about very eloquently, since World War II. And I think the investment deal, it really illustrates that. I mean, just reading that is sort of shocking, right? It's a very unusual, weird sort of deal that I think is unthinkable really in any other context in terms of the way in which it's slanted very much in the favor of the U.S. with profit shares and all of that. So my question really is, what is the debate or the discussion like in Japan on this linkage of, economics and the security alliance? Is that sort of sustainable, over time if it sort of continues? And what would your advice be to sort of the Americans here about, and maybe to the Trump administration about how to, balance that in a way that doesn't jeopardize sort of the long-term health of the alliance?
It's a very difficult question. So I think first of all, I think I really worry about the Japanese population's mind. So I don't know I'm not sure United States go back the previous position or not, but it is a time. I think this is the time, the first time in 80 years. So the kind of security situation is dramatically changing. But unfortunately, from my perspective, many Japanese people don't think about such kind of dynamics. And but I think so. I think within my ministry, economic security is strongly related to the national security issues, and we can compensate the kind of national security spending by United States by contributing economic securities, providing economic security from Japan to United States. But many Japanese people don't think about such kind of issues. So I think we have to improve people's mind. We have to contribute economic security issues in return for the kind of national security issues from the United States. Without such kind of population's mind change, it's very difficult to contribute the strengthen the U.S. and Japan's alliance.
Thank you. Professor Mori, if we could put the question to you, the same one just on sort of the new link that has been made, how difficult will it be to manage that?
Yes. First point is that officially these economic and the security issues were compartmentalized during the negotiation. And, but I think it's undeniable that policymakers and the negotiators had to think what might happen if they don't cut a deal before the deadline of the reciprocal tariffs. And there could have been risks about President Trump making remarks on the security area to pressure Japan to sort of be more sort of flexible to American demand. So there were some probably implicit linkages between security and economy. But the important thing, this is my second point, was that the great thing that the Japanese government did this time around was to avoid the appearance of being pressured into making investment into the United States. They framed it into the context of economic security. And they said, we're going to invest in some of the strategic sectors like AI, semiconductor, and pharmaceuticals, and various sectors. And they committed to making $550 billion investment over the next several years. And so this should be sort of framed in a way so that the Japanese government, the Japanese general public do not see or understand that this is sort of like payment for security. And they sort of reframed it in this economic security context, and that we're sort of realigning our supply chain overseas. And I think this should be taken as an opportunity to sort of inject ourselves and increase our economic presence within the United States, so that there is a more wider understanding inside the United States that Japan is economically important to the United States. And I think this is an opening, quite frankly. And this is an opportunity that the Japan should be capitalizing on. And we are going to establish two committees. One's called the Investment Committee, that is going to be chaired by Secretary of Commerce. But there's also going to be a consultative committee that is going to be bilateral. And Japan's going to be represented in that committee to make recommendations about what kind of investment should be made in the strategic sectors. So with that kind of mechanism, I think there's an opportunity for Japan to increase economic ties with the United States and thereby generate the notion at the grassroots level that Japan matters for the United States economy. Maybe I'm not quite sure what kind of impact we'll deliver at the end of 3 years, but it's better than just being, appearing to be sort of pressured into making some sort of investment. So that was a sort of an adaptation by the Japanese diplomatic authorities to make the alliance durable in the face of this management of a new type of Republican administration. Yeah.
Thank you. So if I could turn the question a little bit for Danny and Chris, and it's maybe I'd turn it this way. If you look at sort of the investment deal, but also the trade deals that President Trump has negotiated, essentially his trade deals, not to go back to the first panel, but his trade deals are essentially 15% plus US tariffs on other countries, and in response, no additional tariffs by those countries on the United States, plus these investment deals that are relatively extractive, I would say, right, rather than normally balanced. And we talked about the US-Japan one, but there's obviously a lot of friction about the US-South Korea one at the moment, where they're even worried about their own liquidity issues, being able to pull off a $350 billion investment deal. So my question is, Chris, you said, it's unlikely to go back, and I guess a point sort of supporting that. I know I pushed back a little bit on it a second ago, but imagine a future debate on U.S. alliance policy, say in 2028 or afterwards, where on the one hand someone says, we should have a balanced relationship with Japan, and Japan's a really important ally, and on the other hand someone says, well actually, we are able to use this alliance as leverage to get this really unbalanced trade deal and to get this really unbalanced investment deal that works to our benefit. So we should continue to ride that horse, and really press our allies on that. Is that the new world we're in? And like, how would you, Danny, maybe if we start with you, like, how would you respond to that? And do you think that's sort of a, not necessarily healthy, but sort of a sustainable, approach, or are we sort of headed for trouble?
We are up to our hips, if not our chest, in trouble already, and the waters are rising. My experience, not to overly personalize it, but genuinely my experience in diplomacy as a foreign service officer taught me early that people, other countries, other communities, people will do more for you willingly if they believe that there is a common purpose, that you're operating with them in good faith and factoring in their interests as well, then you can possibly bully or coerce them into doing for you. The United States is now conducting an experiment in bullying. I'd be careful about dignifying the situation by describing a linkage between economic security and national security. It looks a lot more like a shakedown in which we are telling allies that you're going to have to pay for our protection. And the currency is not simply more defense spending or investment in strategic industries in the United States, but it's a whole plethora of, as you said, extractive and coercive measures. And whether Chris is right about the United States sort of never going back or not will be revealed in the fullness of time. But the same question should be asked about Japan. Will Japan ever go back? Can the trust that has formed the foundation of this extraordinary U.S.-Japan partnership be restored to a level that will allow us to operate with the degree of alignment that we need to have to face the incredible challenges that are before us?
Great, thank you. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, so an excellent question, Tom. I guess I would, and first of all, I very much agree with much of what Danny just said. I think in the end, on this question of tactics and an approach on trade and the economic relationship, ultimately I think this will be shown to be an ineffective approach and will yield very little in the way of economic benefit to the United States and potentially result in significantly more cost when we think about tariffs and the impact on prices, and unlikely to generate much in the way of increased foreign direct investment in the United States. So I think there's a basic effectiveness question that will become clearer over time. I also think that should these tactics continue, it's true that in the short term, Japan does not have great choices when it comes to strategic partnerships, and that the United States remains the most important relationship it has, but that can change over time. And you see Japan today even actively working to cultivate deeper ties with Europe, the European Union, with Australia, with other partners in East Asia. So over time, Japan will have more choices, and that will decrease US leverage as well. So I think there's an ineffectiveness point in the short term, and a decreasing leverage point over time as well. Let me just say a bit about what I meant by the United States not going back. What I mean by that is I think you're exactly right, Tom, that future administrations may place more priority on alliance relationships, recognize that the United States cannot accomplish what it wants to in the world without alliance relationships, and return to an emphasis on those. But I think this sense that our allies must do more is not going back. And I think, look back on my time in the Biden administration, for example, when Japan made its historic announcement in 2022 about increasing the defense budget to 2% of GDP and this grand strategy, we probably applauded a little too much. And it was an historic change, but if it is true, as Japan says itself in its national security strategy, that it confronts the most challenging security environment since the end of World War II, then 2% of GDP should be the floor and not the ceiling that we all applaud. So, I think that's the part that's not going back, that the sense that allies must step forward and do more, and that is part of securing the American commitment to their security. I think that's probably going to be a common feature of any administration. Not entirely new, but a more sort of central feature of any administration going forward.
Great, thank you. So we'll open it up shortly, but I wanted to touch on one or two other things before we do. And one is just talking about the regional security environment. One is Taiwan. There was a story, I think, in the Financial Times a couple of months ago or a month ago about Pentagon officials pressing Japan and regional allies on what they would do specifically in the event of a contingency with Taiwan, which of course seemed a bit unusual since the U.S. is not explicit on what it would do, what we would do in a similar contingency. But that created a little bit of friction, and there's also been a number of stories on U.S.-Taiwan relations, including basically the cancellation of the transit of President Lai's, transit, the downgrading of a military dialogue with Taiwan, and more recently reports about a pause on a possible arms sale to Taiwan, all in the run-up to sort of diplomacy with China about a summit. And so I guess my question, and I'll sort of leave it to whoever wants to jump in first here before I arbitrarily call on someone, but my question is sort of looking at all of that and looking at China's ambitions on Taiwan, and looking at speculation this year that we might see some gray zone activity, whether it's on some sort of quarantine or custom zone style, provocation rather than obviously a full scale sort of invasion. Like how likely are we to see real sort of US-Japan cooperation in Taiwan? What should that look like? What worries all of you in terms of what's coming down the road? So I'll let whoever wants to jump in first jump in. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I think I'd like to make maybe 3 points. My first point is that it's very, very important for the United States and Japanese authorities to talk about what roles they will play in the event of a contingency, so that they are able to clarify the so-called roles, missions, and capabilities at a very articulate way. But I don't think the purpose of that kind of dialogue should be aimed at making each country committed to a particular course of action during contingency. Rather, I think there are many scenarios that you can think about Taiwan. And so the idea is to sort of identify a range of possible responses by Japan and the United States in the event of a Taiwan crisis, so that we don't surprise each other during this kind of a crisis. And so I think this kind of dialogue should move forward. I think the FD reporting said that Japan was shocked or something, and Australia was shocked, but I don't think they were. I mean, they've been having this kind of TTX and various other discussions. So this kind of dialogue and deeper discussion on how to respond to Taiwan contingency should continue and get into a deeper discussion. Second point is that generally speaking, I think that even the current national security strategy and the national defense strategy and the defense build-up plan aims to build up Japanese defense capabilities to the point that Japan will be able to assume a sort of a full role of the defense of Japan. The traditional division of labor for the defense of Japan, in the narrow context of defense of Japan, has been characterized as American spear and Japanese shield, meaning that Japan would assume defensive operations and US forces would assume offensive operations for the defense of Japan. But Japan acquiring new capabilities such as counterstrike capabilities and limited offensive capabilities for the defense of Japan actually frees up US forces that have been devoted to the defense of Japan, and they will be able to concentrate on the defense of Taiwan. And so we're shifting from a sort of a functional division of labor to a theater division of labor, where Japan's going to be more concentrating on the defense of Japan to enable more effective US military operations to defend Taiwan. And Japan, through that kind of role, will be sort of bolstering the coalition capability to resist Chinese aggression, right? The third point, the real challenge is about how to deal with China's multifaceted coercion campaign, which is economic, military, and information. And I don't think we have an effective or a sort of a systematic counter-coercion strategy right now. This is going to be very, very difficult because any sort of counter-coercion strategy at the gray zone level is not going to be about deterrence, but it's going to be about compellence. And if you want to compel China, you need to escalate quite significantly. But I don't think there's the political resolve to escalate to the point where you sort of force China to reverse course in terms of coercing Taiwan. So it's very, very hard to design and come up with a viable or politically acceptable counter-coercion strategy. It's probably going to be asymmetric rather than symmetric response in military, economic, and information domains. But I think there's a work to be done about how to deal with China's gray zone activities towards not only Taiwan, but also South China Sea, East China Sea. I think those are some major issues that Japan and the United States will have to continue consulting on. But yeah, I'll stop here. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else want to come in on that? Danny?
Well,
yeah.
I think Professor Mori makes some very important and very good points, particularly on the need for political and strategic alignment between Washington and Tokyo in order to be able to develop or execute a meaningful counter-coercion strategy. So there's a big difference between what the two of us might attempt to do in terms of deterrence, and I think the immediate, the set of deterrent requirements, and what we need to have and would do in a war-fighting scenario. So at the rhetorical level, there's a lot of alignment on Taiwan policy between Washington and Tokyo. But I think in terms of strategy and in terms of posture, there are significant gaps and some mismatch. Now, for Washington, I think that the Taiwan issue is really a matter of the geopolitical struggle with China. Whereas, not to speak for Japan, but I think that for Japan, it is really an immediate national sovereignty and survival issue, given the threat that Japan is under in the Southwest Islands and more broadly from China. There's a lot of ambiguity as to how Japan would really respond in a crisis scenario in the Taiwan Strait. But today, there is unprecedented ambiguity about how the US would respond. And there's no small number of people in and out of Taiwan who are holding their breath, waiting to see what comes out of the next expected meeting between Xi and Trump in Korea at APEC, let alone the anticipated visit by Trump to Beijing sometime next year, that could very, very dramatically and directly affect Taiwan's security and the American commitment.
Chris, did you want to come in?
Sure, I'll just say a couple of words on this. First of all, I very much agree with Danny about the sort of uncertainty about where the administration is headed on Taiwan. And I think one of the I talked about the underlying structural realities in the US-China relationship that I think are going to endure, but there is a short-term question about what concessions Xi Jinping may seek from President Trump related to Taiwan. And I'm not worried about abandonment or any sort of dramatic developments along those lines, but I am worried about changes in American rhetorical policy that send signals to both sides about real American commitment to Taiwan. On the US, Japan, and Taiwan question, I just say quickly, when I first started at the Pentagon in 2010, we didn't talk about Taiwan with our Japanese friends. It was a taboo subject. It's too sensitive for the Japanese side. The United States, frankly, thought it didn't need Japan to deal with the problem. We are in a fundamentally different place today. There is deep dialogue. There is a level of contingency planning that's happening. I think so that's all very good. What I sense, though, and I differ a little bit with Danny on this, I think there is an urgency mismatch to some extent between, it is definitely true that there is a recognition in Japan that a conflict over Taiwan would be existential for Japan. But I think the sense of the likelihood of that happening is different between us today. And I think the level of urgency on the part of the United States is higher than it is in Japan. And that results in slower movement on this than might be desired. And I think one manifestation of that is also the fact that there's relatively limited dialogue directly between Japan and Taiwan authorities on security questions. And my view is that that's pretty urgent.
Thank you. And Mr. Nishida, did you want to come in, or?
Yeah, I totally agree with Chris' sense. So honestly, Japan's food supply, more than 60% depends on overseas. And the energy supply, more than 80% depends on overseas. So once Taiwan crisis happened, those supply should be stopped. So Taiwan issue is very critical for Japan's future. But unfortunately, yeah, I tell you, so lack of the feeling of risks is a very important. So we should, yeah, so I'm an energy guy, so from the energy perspective, Taiwan crisis is very, very important. So that's why, so now 40% of LNG gas import from Australia, and the United States, Japan depend on 10% of LNG import from US. So that's why it's very important a little bit expand the import from US rather than Australia. So such kind of issue we have to consider quickly. It's very important.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then we'll open it up, and it's just on North Korea and South Korea. So on North Korea, we have probably for the first time in decades, like real military modernization in North Korea because of Russian assistance. Russia's providing considerable assistance to Pyongyang. We're not totally sure exactly how, but in a number of respects, and of course North Korea is involved more in Russian, in the war against Ukraine and all of that, but there is sort of a gathering threat, I would say, or increased threat level from North Korea. Then on South Korea, we did have the trilateral. We have the trilateral of course, but the question is, what's its future? What's the future of Japan, South Korea relations in the Trump administration, given the shift there? Perhaps Professor Mori, we could begin with you. But how do you see this set of issues?
I briefly looked at the joint statement delivered by the foreign ministers meeting of the U.S.-Japan ROK trilateral, and I think Secretary Rubio consented to this joint statement that was very positive, by the way. So more continuity than change. So I think existing programs to advance military exercises and other areas of cooperation is likely to continue, at least for now. And I think we have to seek the right opportunity to have a sort of a heads of state level meeting. But nevertheless, what is important is that actual on the ground working level cooperation moves forward with the necessary budget and the people. And we also have a secretariat that serves as a sort of an anchor to move forward some of the existing programs. So at the moment, I'm not that pessimistic about the future of that multilateral. So I'll leave it at that.
Do you worry about an increased role for Russia in Northeast Asia, particularly with North Korea? Like,
Yes.
how do you see that?
Yes, that's a point that expert community in Tokyo and also policymakers are very much concerned about. But it's not necessarily clear what kind of specific assistance is provided. There are talks about military technology transfer, but what kind is unclear. But nevertheless, we do worry about that aspect of Russian assistance to North Korea's military modernization efforts. Yeah.
Thank you. Danny?
I think the strategic logic of the perceived unreliability of the United States in the Trump administration is a force that tends to drive Seoul and Tokyo to coordinate more closely. And certainly the pressure from China has the same effect. We'll see what the outcome of the elections in Japan will be, and that could have could provide a bit of a speed bump in South Korea-Japan relations. But I think fundamentally what we see is a trend towards strengthening that bilateral coordination and cooperation, and as part of that in the security sphere, some increases in trilateral efforts, although I think they are inadequate and quite slow. To my mind, the Russian DPRK now alliance certainly is alarming, but it is only a matter of degree, really, that in terms of exacerbating the threat from North Korea. Even without Russian technology, North Korea poses a very virulent and growing threat against Japan, against South Korea, and against the United States. We're living on borrowed time. It really is only a matter of time before North Korea reaches its threshold of confidence in its nuclear triad, its second strike capabilities, such as to choose to begin the process of extorting Japan, South Korea, and the United States. They'll call it negotiations, but it's effectively to negotiate surrender, not merely the rhetorical acceptance of North Korea as a legitimate nuclear state that's freed from penalties and sanctions, but to begin negotiating effectively the withdrawal of the U.S. security posture in the Western Pacific. That, I think, is a North Korean goal. So the danger is immense, and we shouldn't be lulled into complacency by virtue of the fact that it's been however many years since the last North Korean nuclear test.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, sure. I'll just a couple of words on the U.S.-Japan ROK dimensions of this, because I think Danny's captured the threat very well. Look, I think it is significant, as Mori Sensei said, that Secretary Rubio has continued the commitment to the trilateral foreign ministers dialogue. So, I said up front that there's been some disengagement from the administration on minilateralism, but I think in the case of the State Department's efforts, the commitment remains there. And I agree with Danny that, at the moment, the relationship between Japan and South Korea is strong. I think there's uncertainty about what comes next after a new prime minister is elected. But I think it's been quite positive to see the approach that President Lee in South Korea has taken to the relationship with Japan. So I feel pretty good about the future of that relationship, at least in the near term. I think the question for me is, can we take the next steps on military cooperation, which are essential to deterrence, without leader-level engagement? It was at Camp David that the three leaders announced a commitment to deeper information sharing related to missile threats. That required a political decision to get us to real-time threat information sharing. And the next steps in military cooperation are hard politically, right? Are we going to move toward doing trilateral contingency planning? Are we going to move toward sharing information on cyber threats? Are we going to begin to co-locate people in our commands? These are kind of the next obvious steps, but they're not going to happen without political decisions. And that's where I do worry that without that engagement from the White House, that it'll be harder to take the military steps that I think are really, really important to sustaining deterrence.
Thank you. Mr. Nishida, did you want to come in on this? Or?
A little bit short comment. So I think it's in order to deal with North Korea issues. So relationship between Japan and Korea is very important, and especially the leadership relationship. And I was a little bit surprised after new president elected in North Korea. So new president didn't change his foreign policies dramatically. So it's very important after new prime minister elected in Japan. So leadership relationship is very important. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 25 minutes for Q&A, so we will open it up. Do we address everything already? Or Dan has a Dan Dressner.
Never not going to have a question. My question, given Danny's point about the sort of uncertain nature of the security relationship, particularly with respect to Taiwan, it's time to ask the taboo question. What is the likelihood of contingency planning, both in South Korea, particularly Japan, for becoming near nuclear status in terms of not energy, but weapons?
Okay, allied proliferation question, yeah, which is a big, I mean, in the Biden administration, we did a lot about bolstering extended deterrence for South Korea. Now, obviously, the Trump administration has not, I think, said anything really to undermine extended deterrence, but there's sort of a feeling in the ether, in terms of its general position on alliances. So, Danny, I think that was directed at you, but anyone else can jump in as well. At everyone, okay.
Well, maybe I'll work backwards and start by saying, in my view, there is no scenario in which South Korea acquires nuclear weapons in which Japan does not follow suit. You're never going to have two nuclear Koreas and a non-nuclear Japan. The forces that would bring South Korea to acquire or possess nuclear weapons, which is fundamentally a lack of faith in the U.S. extended deterrence, would apply every bit as much to Japan as they would to South Korea. What are the scenarios in which South Korea could acquire nuclear weapons? I think it's pretty hard to imagine that South Korea could conduct a clandestine crash program that escaped the notice of the United States. The United States could be persuaded to redeploy tactical nuclear weapons on South Korean soil, perhaps with even a European-style dual-key arrangement of some sort. Maybe the United States could be convinced to sell nuclear weapons to South Korea in the third Trump administration.
It's a lot to digest in that sentence. Yeah.
But there is a logic at work which says that North Korea, if you're sitting in Seoul, Kim Jong-un is very directly threatening us with nuclear weapons. He has discarded the principle of unity of the Korean people and defined us as an enemy state. The United States has, the commitment of the United States has diminished in credibility. And we can only deter Kim Jong-un as Koreans if we have our own nuclear weapons, because Kim Jong-un will not believe that Donald Trump or any US president would really enter into a nuclear contest, whereas Koreans know Koreans, and our leader could successfully deter him. So that is a powerful force that is at work.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your question, Professor Dresner. I think I would like to make maybe 3 or 4 points. My first point is public reaction or public thinking about this issue. University of Tokyo did a survey last year where they asked, do you think Japan should pursue nuclear armament? And to my surprise, I think it was roughly 20% of the respondents said yes. I think it was much lower. I think it was in the single digit, but it's roughly 20%. So that's the number. Also, among public debate, there are far-right commentary talking about Japan should pursue nuclear weapons. I was at a bookstore in Haneda Airport, and there was this magazine by far-right magazine saying that the front cover said, nuclear armament in the age of Trump, which was quite a direct sort of expression. And the whole magazine was devoted to talking about why Japan should go nuclear, right? So that's the public's perception of the issue right now. But I think among policy experts and policy makers, there are rationales that are opposed, that think that nuclear armament is not the right way to go. Number one, in terms of strategic theory, there is this understanding that Japan possessing a sort of a minimal deterrence nuclear armament is not going to mean anything in the face of China's nuclear threat, because ultimately China is going to believe that it has escalation dominance. So without a US backstop, it's not going to mean much for having this kind of a regional independent nuclear deterrent in the region. So that's the strategic theory dimension. The second theory is the fiscal or defense expenditure perspective. And if we were to go nuclear and have our own independent nuclear armament, it's going to require a massive amount of investment, which is going to crowd out investment in conventional capabilities. And at the end of the day, we'll have this force structure that is hugely imbalanced, having a sort of a very modest nuclear arsenal and very small conventional capability. And that's not where we want to go in terms of deterrence, because we would be forced to a situation where we have to decide whether to use nuclear weapons or succumb to pressure. And that's not the place that Japan wants to go. So that's the fiscal dimension. Thirdly, I think the process of acquiring nuclear weapons is very, very important. It would be fraught with very high risk and cost during the process of running up to having a nuclear capability. So that would incur huge diplomatic cost, as well as various other costs. So that's a third rationale. And fourth rationale, political opposition within the Japanese domestic society. I don't think it's possible to garner the majority of the Japanese society to accept the idea that Japan will have its own independent nuclear deterrent. Even though the 20% number is there, I can't really imagine that number going up to 60 or 70% without a dramatic change in Japan's security environment. One possible scenario is that if Taiwan falls under Chinese control, Japan's going to turn into a strategic enclave. U.S. force posture is going to have to dramatically change, and as a result of that, U.S. will be less capable of defending Japan. And at that point, there might be a debate about whether Japan should go nuclear or not. But I think the debate will involve some of the points that I mentioned earlier, and it will probably decide that there are other options. And I think recently I've heard maybe two kinds of options to deal with the current situation. Number one was a policy recommendation delivered by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Kanehara-san was at the center of this, and it was about introduction of nuclear weapons during a crisis. That's a sort of one option that's being submitted. I think second possible option is nuclear sharing. And a couple of years ago, we had a debate in 2022, 3 years ago. And there was a brief moment where this issue was discussed, but ultimately it was rejected. And I think expert testimony to the Liberal Democratic Party were mostly European, Japanese scholars working on European nuclear strategy. And they basically said the NATO-type nuclear sharing arrangement is not going to work for Japan. And at that point, it was sort of closed. The debate was closed. But there is a question. Could there be a sort of an Indo-Pacific version of a nuclear sharing arrangement based on sea-based capabilities? For example, Japan having a submarine capable of launching cruise missiles. So in the future, if we have slicker mens, we shouldn't have nuclear facilities inside Japan, but those submarines could dock into maybe Guam or Honolulu in times of crisis. But this obviously will also require a lot of investment and huge political heavy liftings. But nevertheless, it's a sort of a hypothetical, theoretical concept that is sort of being quietly debated among only just a limited number of experts. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. Could I ask you one follow-up? Because Danny's point, I think, was that, in the scenario where South Korea went nuclear, then, that would have a huge impact on Japan. Your remarks were sort of mainly focused on it sort of in a vacuum, right? Japan wouldn't pursue nuclear weapons potentially for the 4 reasons you said, but let's just not to get too much into hypotheticals, but let's sort of imagine that there were real question marks about the Trump administration's alliance commitment to South Korea, and then it chose to go down the nuclear weapon option route. What would your view be of that, and how complicating do you think that will be for Japan's own position?
I think if South Korea goes nuclear, that means that South Korea has completely lost faith in the U.S. defense commitment, right? And if Japanese society sees an analogy, a parallel analogy being applied to Japan, then there might be a sort of a change in the mood about how we think about nuclear armament. But so that would be the chain of logic. But between the South Korean case and Japan's response, I'm pretty sure that there will be some other intermediate options like nuclear sharing or other sort of arrangement. By the way, for the moment, the mainstream thinking is to actually strengthen U.S. extended deterrence. And the way to do this is by Japan increasing and enhancing its conventional capabilities so that it can engage in deeper discussions with the U.S. defense authorities about escalation management. So this is the so-called conventional nuclear integration, right? So this is a new development. This is a result of Japan fundamentally bolstering its defense capabilities and acquiring new capabilities like counter-strike capabilities. But having this mechanism is actually going to have a sort of a reassuring effect. But at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, the political intention, the political resolve of the United States to intervene in a regional conflict is what matters in terms of credibility. And in order to secure that, US allies and partners like South Korea, like Japan, and like Taiwan needs to convince the US society, not only President Trump and the MAGA people, but the US society, that there is a significant vital interest worth fighting for. Without that kind of recognition, I think any sort of defense arrangement is not going to have any credibility. But that's the major challenge. Can we do that? And I think there's a chance if we have a transactional administration. But if we have an ideologically motivated president who is more sort of defines U.S. national interest in a very narrow way, then it's going to be much more difficult and challenging in that realm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Oh, yes, sorry, yes.
I'm Gil Rosman, Emeritus Professor at Princeton and also the editor of the Awesome Forum. And my question is about whether Ishiba's successor might be moving to the right on policy that relates to comfort women, South Korea, Yasukuni visits, and would this, or the possibility of a coalition with Japan drifting somewhat to the right. Some say that Ishiba's recent shuttle diplomacy was an effort to boost the South Korea-Japan tie in case there could be this kind of backlash with the new leader of Japan. Can you tell us more about the election prospects and whether there could be a rightist drift that could interfere with South Korea ties, particularly when South Korea has a progressive president who previously was pretty critical
Thank you. Professor, do you want to jump in on that?
Poor guy.
Yes, thank you. One of the challenges of trying to predict the next prime minister's position on policies towards South Korea is that what they say before being elected and what they do after they become prime minister can change. And so in the past, I think, for example, candidate Takaichi has been known to have some conservative views of history, and therefore, when she becomes prime minister, South Korea-Japan relations might sour. But I'm not quite sure. She might make a different sort of decision because the LDP is not as dominant as they used to be, and so there are many experts on Japanese politics who anticipate or expect that there will be maybe medium-sized party making a coalition in Japanese domestic politics to advance policy. In that case, I think prime ministers or the cabinet have to sort of moderate their policies to be able to hold that coalition. If they go too far or extreme, then you lose the confidence of the other coalition partners, and you will not be able to manage your government. And therefore, working outside of what is acceptable or taking a sort of an extreme approach that would undermine the relationship with South Korea would not become politically viable. So that's a sort of a structural constraint that might work on any future prime minister that may hold conservative views about history. But we'll have to see. We don't know. I really don't know what's going to come out, but that's one sort of way of trying to understand what might come under the new government. So, yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things. I mean, far be it from me to comment on the domestic politics in Japan or South Korea on this issue, but I guess I would just say it's been striking to me to see in my sort of engagements with Japanese friends over the last couple of years, the evolution in how they talk about the relationship with South Korea. It began with deep skepticism about President Yoon. I think he sort of won them over with his gestures about the importance of the relationship with Japan. That was followed by deep skepticism about President Lee, who has followed up with signals of commitment to the relationship with Japan. So I think I think there is, I share your view, less likely to go back. The other thing I would just say, and I think any new Japanese prime minister will, and Korean president will know this, that they need each other more than ever before in the Trump era. There's more imperative of cooperation than perhaps has been the case in a long time to deal with the United States. So I think that's a factor that also augurs for some continued momentum.
Thank you. Mr. Nishida, do you want to come in? Or no? Okay. Okay, any last, we got up to 8 minutes left, but if there, yes, down here. Thank you. Any other final questions? We'll group them together before we go back to our panelists for a final word.
Any students, I would love to see if any.
Yes.
Yeah, I did want to kind of
affect the issue of Taiwan overall, and acknowledging that very uncertain, or unlikely rather, that the U.S. does substantially weaken its commitment to Taiwan overall. If you do see a sort of reaction in a trade deal or any other form, I was just wondering if panelists could speculate on how Japan might react, whether they try to backfill the U.S. or whether that change their view of the Indo-Pacific security overall.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
In regards to like the alliance managing, I would like to hear like how Japan should like build more like the ASEAN countries to like build more like this because of the security environment to in response to the current U.S. situation.
Thank you. Great questions. So we have Philippines, Taiwan, and ASEAN. And let's start off with Mr. Nishida. Yeah. Just any of that, but also anything you want to say, just wrapping up on the discussion overall. So don't feel bound by the questions necessarily.
Okay. I'm really concerned about how to strengthen the alliance. Not only with U.S. but also European country. But Europe, U.S. and Japan, total population is just 0.8 billion. Chinese population is 1.4 billion. So U.S., Japan, and the EU alliance is not enough. So I strongly believe involving ASEAN countries is very important. But at the same time, for ASEAN countries, China is very important countries. So we have to understand the position of an ASEAN country, very subtle. So for ASEAN countries, it's difficult to take a hard line against China. But same thing is happening in Japan. For Japan, China is still a very important market. So for Japan, it's difficult to take single out China. So that's why we can make a good collaboration with ASEAN, and we can explain the U.S. The U.S. I think U.S. can take a hard line against China, but the situation is quite different from U.S. The Japanese position and the ASEAN position is quite different. So that's why we can make a good collaboration with ASEAN countries, and involving the ASEAN country and this alliance is very important to maintain the supply chain against beyond China.
Thank you. Chris?
Sure. Maybe I'll just try to address two of the questions. First, on Japan's role in the region, as I tried to say in my opening remarks, I think the task of building a regional security architecture now falls more to Japan for the next several years. I think there is still in place strong fundamentals to deepen cooperation among the Philippines, Australia, Japan, South Korea, a convergence of perceived security interests. I think the United States will be less in a position, less inclined to drive this effort, but I think Japan has a huge role to play. And I think on the Philippines in particular, I think one of the most, I agree that there is risk of unintended escalation, but I think the decision by the Philippines to stand up to Chinese maritime encroachment is one of the most important strategic developments in Southeast Asia that we've seen in years, and I think it is deeply in the US and Japanese interest to support the Philippines in sticking up for itself. Actually, the Trump administration, I think, is off to a pretty good start in that regard. The military assistance continues. Secretary Hegseth visited Manila on his trip to the region. So my hope is that the support for the Philippines, both by the United States, but also Japan, including in the security area, will continue, because I think it's important.
Thank you. Danny?
Well, I'd begin by differentiating between spark and ignition. So first of all, the U.S. forces and Chinese forces are quite professional and have, by and large, developed the capacity to interact at close quarters with minimized, not zero, risk of an incident or a collision. And I think the same is true of the Taiwan forces as well. The Philippines is a bit of a different story. They're far less sophisticated, far less experienced. I admire, like Chris does, their resolve and capability. I also think that in the Chinese calculus, this is very much a Marcos administration phenomenon, and that there probably is a temptation in Beijing to not merely to wait to see if there could be a return to Duterte or another more pliant Philippine government, but actually to work toward that objective, which ironically may argue for a little more restraint and patience on Beijing's part, although I wouldn't want to bank the sort of future of mankind on that calculus. The ignition piece, though, is really the question of what would the Chinese government and the American government do if there were a 2001 EP3 kind of incident, and in a South China Sea scenario could easily be something that begins with the Chinese accidentally or deliberately taking lethal military force action against Philippine forces that inexorably draws the United States in. And that's an open question. The mechanisms of restraint, of communication, of de-escalation that were built up, such as they were, over the years between Washington and Beijing, have been demolished. There's nobody to foam the runway in an emergency, in a crisis. And even in the good old days between George Bush Sr. and Jiang Zemin, it was hellish. It was not easy. So there is unquestionable risk there, but clearly Donald Trump and Xi Jinping want to avoid nuclear war. They want to avoid war between them. And so these are two contradictory forces, I think, that will grind against each other in that scenario. I think just on the Taiwan question, what I would say is that the sort of path of least resistance when it comes to what we would calculate as risk in the upcoming meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi Jinping is, as Chris pointed out, not that there's going to be a fourth communique or a deal to trade or sell Taiwan for some benefit, but rather that Donald Trump, by adopting the vocabulary of Xi Jinping, of the Chinese doctrine, will essentially signal to the Taiwan public and political class that he favors the benefits of his economic relationship with Xi Jinping over the existence and welfare of the democratic society on Taiwan, and that the Chinese strategy of convincing people on Taiwan that resistance is futile will have seriously advanced. In that scenario, the question for Japan is not really so much a military one as much as a political, economic, diplomatic one. And I would expect Japan to redouble its efforts to try to help support both the economy and the political autonomy of Taiwan.
Thank you. Professor Mori, any final, you're the wrap-up speaker, so the questions, but also any final comments on the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to maybe briefly answer the question regarding the Philippines and also maybe sort of Taiwan. the Taiwan issue. On the Philippines, we have a deepening relationship. We have the bilateral relationship with Philippines. We have the trilateral with U.S., Japan, Philippines, and also the so-called Squad, U.S., Japan, Australia, Philippines. And traditionally, we've been providing capacity building, for example, for Coast Guard and so forth. But we have this new scheme that was initiated back in 2022, decided in 2022 and implemented in 23, called the Official Security Assistance, which is to provide capacity building programs in the area of security and defense. And this is a new area, and I think the Japanese government is exploring new projects so that it can help countries like the Philippines to bolster their defense capabilities. And that's a sort of a new area where Japan wants to strengthen relationship with the Philippines. I think the Philippines is going to have a presidential election, maybe in 2027, is it? If I recall correctly. And when I went to a conference in Manila, I spoke with the local experts, and they said that the direction or the foreign policy orientation of the president significantly impacts the way it handles security policy, particularly with respect to South China Sea and China. And if you have a president that sees China in a very different light, then the level of security cooperation and defense cooperation might be affected by his political inclinations towards China and so forth. So we have to see how much cooperation we can advance within the next several years. Lastly, on Taiwan, I talked about Japan's possible response and contingency planning. And this is a sort of a general comment, but I think government-to-government relations regarding possible responses to a Taiwan crisis or a Taiwan contingency is advancing at an amazing pace. And this is quite impressive, I think. I think Russell-san and Johnston-san also mentioned this. But I'm worried about the public opinion. How would the public respond to a Taiwan crisis? And I'm pretty sure that China will deploy information operations against the Japanese society. And one of the fundamental questions that will be raised during a crisis is, why should Japanese citizens risk their lives to defend Taiwan? And I don't think any country or society is prepared for a great power conflict. So it's going to be very, very tough for the Japanese political leaders to explain to the general public why the US-Japan alliance must work towards exercising immediate deterrence and responding to a possible Chinese aggression towards Taiwan. But this is not going to work during a crisis. I think the peacetime debate and framing of the issue is going to be critical. I think people really need to understand what the phrase means. The phrase Taiwan contingency is Japan's contingency. People tend to think in terms of scenarios, like how many missiles are going to be flying at Japanese territory and so forth. But the true thinking begins with this deep thinking about what is going to happen to our security, political independence, and territorial integrity if Taiwan falls under Chinese control. And this question needs to be answered by all American allies and partners, and also maybe the United States as well. We have to really think about what is at stake in Taiwan. And if we think in very abstract terms like democracy, technology, military strategy, it's going to be too sort of vague. But I think we should have like a very vivid scenario where we have to think about how our lives will be affected if Taiwan falls under Chinese control. And by doing that, I think we begin to understand the necessary costs and risks that we have to assume now in order to prevent that kind of calamity from happening. And so this kind of deep discussion is really, really important when we think about how to respond and prepare so that we are able to deter and prevent a Taiwan continuous Taiwan crisis. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking all of our panelists for a terrific conversation. We turn it over to...
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Tom, and thanks to our panelists in both panels for a great, rich set of discussions. That concludes the public portion of our forum today. Thank you all again for joining us here at the Princeton SPIA DC Center. I will gently invite you to move out to the other room, and you can enjoy your continued conversations in the lounge and on the rooftop. My team is actually going to flip this event or this space for another event shortly, and then I will invite our moderators, our panelists, and our co-hosts to reconvene here again in this room in about 22 minutes. Thanks very much, everyone.